So churches are taking over warehouses across the country. But what does that say about the economy? Let's talk about it. Now, I'm sure this is not the first time you've seen people complain about this. And every time this topic comes up, we see the fact that churches are taking over warehouses as a negative, But that is exactly not my focus in this video. Rather, what I want to do is to use this phenomenon as an indicator of how Nigeria is less industrialized today than it was 30, 40 years ago. So the question we should ask ourselves is, why is Nigeria less industrialized today? Now, I suppose you can offer different arguments for that. But one fascinating argument that I've read is globalization being responsible for the de-industrialization of Africa. I just finished reading this book, Emerging Africa by Kingsley Moghalu. Kingsley Moghalu is a former deputy governor of the Central Bank of Nigeria and a former presidential aspirant. And by the way, in this book, he talks about many topics from foreign aid, to the rise of China, to the need for African countries to develop their worldview, to the role of Africa in international organizations like the World Bank, IMF, and a bunch of other topics like that. It's a very fascinating book to read. But I want to zero in on his argument on globalization. Now, according to Moghalu, globalization has been a negative thing for most African countries. He argues that Bretton Woods institutions like the World Bank, the IMF, proposed neoliberal policies for African countries to adopt, and many African countries mindlessly adopted those policies. Unfortunately, those policies came at a cost. So African countries adopted structural adjustment programs, they devalued their currencies, they eliminated tariffs, and the consequence of all these policies was that it led to the death of the manufacturing sector, which ultimately led to the deindustrialization of most African economies. So which is why warehouses are empty today and churches are buying those warehouses. I read to you, Moghalu, economic globalization has hurt Africa. The gains for African countries from opening up to international economic forces without adequate internal preparation have been limited and far outweighed by the adverse impact of the continent's engagement with economic globalization. Economic policies enunciated by Bretton Woods institutions, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and the World Trade Organization led to lost decades of development opportunities and outcomes. Structural adjustment and liberalization without the proper foundations as a core condition led to the effective deindustrialization of the continent by weakening the manufacturing sector, increased income inequality, and marked drops on average per capita incomes in many African countries. Trade liberalization under WTO regimes has not brought benefit. It has removed incomes from tariffs previously available to African countries, and these incomes have not been replaced by effective internal resource mobilization through taxes and other methods. He also contrasts the African experience with globalization with countries like Malaysia. So in Malaysia, they did not mindlessly adopt globalist policies. Rather, they approached globalization from a nationalist perspective. They were very selective in the globalist policies they adopted. For instance, in Malaysia, they imposed tariffs on the importation of foreign cars to protect the local auto industry. I find this argument interesting because today, globalization is also under suspicion when you listen to people like Donald Trump. Donald Trump every now and then complains of how globalization has hurt the American economy. He argues that because of globalization, many jobs have been offshored to countries like China because of cheap labor, and that has led to the deindustrialization of the American economy. But anyways, I just wanted to talk about Moghalu's arguments regarding globalization. Do you think this somehow explains why churches are buying warehouses today?